Let me make sure I have it here. Okay. Okay, let me. So basically, first I'm just going to review like some of the literature and the current dietary guidelines, and then I want to just tell you a little bit kind of about like what I do and how I manage my patients. And I know you guys are strapped for time when you're in with a patient because they have so much else going on with them. And so, you know, just kind of coming up with some quick ways that don't take more than 5 minutes to sort of dig into their diet and find out, you know, how you can help in terms of that. Also review food-based approaches. A lot of times when we throw numbers at patients, they don't really understand, you know, all the things on the labels. So coming up with some practical solutions that they can do in their own kitchen. And then I have, which I'm most excited about, is I put together a compilation of a bunch of handouts and links that you guys can use to refer your patients to help further educate them. So for heart failure, the current guidelines, they recommend an individualized eating plan, but they don't really go over exactly what all that entails. So it mostly is with consideration to comorbidities that the patient might have. So in addition to the sodium restriction of 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per day, if somebody's diabetic, that would require additional restrictions. Fluid restriction of 1 to 2 liters per day, and also encourage physical activity just mainly based on the patient's current abilities, because this can help like decrease, you know, increase strength and decrease problems like shortness of breath. And then also considering cardiac rehab for clinically stable patients. So the benefits of sodium and fluid restriction, there's not like a whole lot of studies on this, but they have found that it's reduced symptom burden like shortness of breath, you know, fluid overload, difficulty breathing when laying flat, things like that. And it's also affected quality measures like readmission rate and decreased length of stay, mortality rate, and then renal function and certain clinical laboratory measures. So sodium is mainly found in processed foods. So 77% of the sodium we get in our diet comes from commercially prepared foods rather than things that we add from the salt shaker. So it's important when I'm educating my patients to try to get them away from processed food as much as possible. And a lot of times they'll say to me, oh, I don't eat any salt at all. Well, things don't always taste salty, but they still can be. For example, like Oreos, you know, bread doesn't necessarily taste salty, but it can add up. If somebody has 2 pieces of toast, you're looking at about 600 milligrams of sodium, which is, you know, a quarter of their day. Also with the fluid restriction, it's important to consider foods that may contribute to this too. So typically 2 liters works out to around like 4 pint glasses of liquid per day. So sometimes I'll, you know, rather than having patients count every milliliter that comes from their food, I'll generally say, you know, have three pint glasses of fluid a day, and then you can, you know, instead of the 4th one, that can be used for foods like watermelon, for example. A cup of watermelon has about 5 ounces in it. So it's important to consider this also. For lipids, so one of the main things that I encourage patients to do is limit their added sugars in their diet. And it's nice with the new food label updates that are coming in 2020. I've already seen a lot of companies are putting added sugars on the label now so that you're able to better distinguish between the sugars that come from fruits and, you know, the sugars that come from what the manufacturer adds. So the AHA recommends limiting added sugars to less than 100 calories a day for women, which works out to about 25 grams, and less than 150 calories for men, or about 37 grams. So meta-analysis of 39 randomized controlled trials showed that a higher intake of added sugars was associated with significant increase in triglycerides, LDL, and blood pressure. What's that? Oh, did someone just join?
You're good.
Okay. Lee et al., they followed 85,000 women and about 43,000 men for 24 to 30 years. And they found there was no reduction in coronary disease risk, and actually trend toward increased risk when calories from saturated fat were replaced with equal calories from sugar and refined carbs. It's further demonstrated here to give you an idea. When we're talking to patients, it's important to consider when we tell them something they can't have, they're just going to eat more of something else. So if we say no saturated fat, you know, cut out all like fatty meats and whatnot, well, a lot of patients will then just eat more sugar. But we really want to consider like a healthy eating pattern so that we're giving them healthy suggestions to eat instead. So here, when saturated fats were replaced with trans fats, there was actually a 5% increase in risk. And same with like carbohydrates from refined sugars was 1% increase. So our monounsaturated fatty acids and our polyunsaturated fatty acids, and especially the omega-3s, are going to be the most beneficial substitutes, and also whole grains. Okay. So again, need to consider the types of fat we recommend. So replacing saturated and trans fats with the heart-healthy fats. And we'll talk about this from a food-based approach a little bit later. Okay. So as I said before, when we're planning our meals, we don't pick out nutrients. You know, no one packs their kids lunch and is like, okay, I'm going to pack some vitamin A, and you know, here's some omega-3s, and we consider it from foods. So when I'm talking to patients, I try to communicate in that sort of language to them and giving specific examples for what they can do. So in general, this sort of follows like a Mediterranean eating pattern, which has been shown to be very beneficial from a cardiovascular standpoint. So most importantly is eat as many vegetables and fruits as possible. Also replace fine grains with whole grains. So boiled whole grains are better than processed grains like bread. Decrease red meat and replace fish and non-animal proteins. Also avoiding all processed meats, so that's things like sausage, bacon. Consuming healthy fats and limiting foods rich in saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. So when I meet with patients, usually I'll start by gathering baseline diet information. I'll have them recall everything they normally eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, snacks and beverages. If you're strapped for time, which I know most of you all probably are when you're meeting with your patients, you could even just have them do a 24-hour recall. And I'm usually surprised by how many people will like admit like, oh, I had McDonald's on the way to my cards appointment today. And you know, at least they're honest, but some people won't be as forthcoming. So that's when you kind of want to dig a little deeper and ask them to describe what they're eating. Sometimes they'll just say, oh, I had a meat and a vegetable for dinner. Okay, well, what type of meat did you have? Did you prepare it at home? Did you go out to eat? You know, how often do you go out to eat? So just digging for questions like that. And what I'm looking for there is sort of like the low-hanging fruit, trying to identify, you know, out of all those food categories, trying to pick out something that is maybe like the biggest source of, I guess, dietary problems, where we can get the biggest change with the smallest effort. So if they're drinking a ton of pop, I'll pick that out and say, okay, you know, that would be a good goal to work on. And I'll, of course, you know, everybody's their own person. So I'm not going to be able to force somebody to make these changes, but I try to find a motivational source and sort of elaborate on that. But anyway, so I'll start with those small changes. So I'll say something like, you know, looking at your eating habits, I think the biggest benefits would come from switching from canned vegetables to frozen vegetables. What do you think? And then get their feedback. And it's also important to assess how ready they are to change. So I'll ask them how important are these changes for them? Again, looking for motivation sources, and how confident are you that you can make these changes? And this will help bring out some of those barriers and find out maybe why some patients seem non-compliant, but maybe it's that they can't afford food, or they live far from the grocery store and they don't have a ride. Or, you know, their mom's in the hospital and their kids play 100 sports each, and, you know, they're just running around constantly. So they haven't really been able to get it together in terms of diet, but they want to eventually. It's just they need some help getting there. So one of the biggest barriers I face around here is, unfortunately, like a lot of my patients just can't afford healthy food. And they perceive that you know, it's so expensive, why even try? So it's the number 2 on the list of states where residents are most likely to struggle to afford food. So 23% of West Virginians struggle to afford enough food, let alone the right foods. And sadly, these are like some of the coping strategies that people have to make. So 69% had to choose between food and utilities, and 57% had to choose between food and housing. Some people had to sell off personal property. The most common coping strategy is 79% purchased inexpensive, unhealthy food. That was just the easiest solution for them. Another issue is it's, you know, in West Virginia, there's a lot of hills and people live far from each other. There's not always access to a store right there. And unfortunately, people with lower incomes tend to have issues with transportation as well. So they're not always able to get into these sort of like the city areas that have the big box stores, which is like Target, Walmart, Sam's Club, where you can find basically anything you need. Grocery stores too tend to be closer to like the more higher income neighborhoods. So that's things like Kroger, Food Lion, Price Cutter. And those are where you're going to be able to find more of like more affordable produce and also specialty low sodium items. So 75% of the food stores in the state are actually small box stores and convenience stores. So like, I don't know if you've ever tried to look for a healthy snack at a gas station, but it's really difficult. And only 5% of these stores sell any fresh produce at all. So it's a big problem. Again, that goes with limited economic resources. Also, we talked about the geographic isolation and lack of transportation. Lack of knowledge is another thing. And also just being, I guess, either lack of knowledge about cooking skills or being self-conscious about them. I find that in women a lot more. So they'll say something like, you know, if I cook low sodium, I don't think my husband and kids, they won't eat it. I won't be able to prepare something that's palatable and also healthy. And also just in general, teaching them the basics about food labels is important, and being able to identify those healthful foods in the first place. And also the conflicting messages from the media, you know, don't eat bananas or whatever. There's all these different trends all the time, and that people take that in, and it kind of, you know, it kind of skews their viewpoint on what's healthy and what's not. And then also lack of time and competing priorities. This sort of can fit into either of the first two categories, because people that, you know, low income families unfortunately may have to work longer hours, and they won't have as much time dedicated to food shopping and food prep. And also lack of knowledge. You know, if people don't know how to prepare the food in the first place, it's probably going to take them a lot longer, or they're just not going to do it. This is one education tool. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with this, but I use this with my patients a lot just because it's really simple, and it sort of breaks it down into like a whole food approach rather than focusing on like processed things. So ideally, at least for lunch and dinner, almost half the plate should be non-starchy vegetables. There can be like some fruit on there too, or a side of fruit. Cooking with healthy oils, and we'll dive into this a little deeper later, but whole grains is a quarter of the plate, or about the size of a fist, or I'm sorry, a size of a hockey puck. And for the healthy protein, that would be like the size of your palm. Okay, so I'm going to drill down into each of these categories a little more just to discuss some like food-based recommendations that you guys can give to your patients. I'll educate them about, you know, the whole plate and low sodium in general, but I'll also spend a little more time just on like whatever specific goal we determined that they could work on. So if the goal was adding more vegetables, then I'll use some of the recommendations from the following slides just to get them started with some ideas. So I'm going to start with the healthy fats, since we just discussed like the lipid-lowering nutrition therapy. So it's saturated fat. So this is mostly from red meat and dairy products, poultry with skin, coconut oil. So this can increase LDL, but it can also increase HDL. So a small to moderate intake of saturated fat technically, you know, can fit in with a healthful eating pattern. I would recommend no more than 15 grams a day though from this, and you know, they should really focus on like the healthier fats first. So trans fats are largely man-made fats, and they've been shown to increase LDL, reduce HDL, stimulate inflammation, and they cause a variety of other changes that damage arteries, so these should be avoided at all costs. Also, hidden sources of trans fats. So unfortunately, in the US, companies are allowed to put 0 grams of trans fat on the label if it contains 0.5 grams or less. In Canada, they don't do this. You'll see something like 0.1 grams of trans fats. So the problem is that if you eat more than 1 serving, you know, you're getting a bunch of trans fats in there and not necessarily even knowing it because it doesn't say in the numbers. But if you look on the ingredients, anything that says hydrogenated oils is important to look out for because that's essentially what it is trans fat. So, so these are some of the healthier fats that it's important to encourage instead of some of the ones in the previous slide, especially the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So this is like walnuts, flax seeds, sunflower seeds, safflower oil. These have a cardioprotective effect and have been shown to be beneficial. Also olive oil, peanut oil, basically liquid plant-based fat sources. Omega-3s are also really good, so that's fatty or oily fish like salmon, mackerel, herring, walnuts, flaxseed, flax oil. And just a note about cooking with oils, so you don't want to heat extra virgin olive oil above 300 degrees Fahrenheit because it'll destroy the antioxidants and it can also produce toxins that you can inhale or ingest, which isn't good. So extra virgin olive oil is great for like already prepared foods like salads and bruschetta and things like that, but you really want to try to use like light olive oil for cooking or like a higher smoke point oil. Safflower oil is the highest, so if you're cooking up to 510 degrees Fahrenheit, then that's a healthy option. So throughout this presentation, I'm just going to be like sprinkling in little recipes and like formulas throughout it, just because I see patients on the fly all the time. And so I never know what I'm walking into. And so I always try to have a few like go-to food-based recommendations for them. And I find myself using these over and over again. So most salad dressing, like commercially prepared salad dressings full of bad fats and sodium. So in my house, we make all of our own dressings, and this is super simple. It's just 3 parts oil, 1 part acid, or if you're like me and you like a lot of acid flavor, I'll do even 2 parts acid, and then add to taste. So it doesn't take much, but just even a little bit of Dijon mustard, even though mustard's kind of salty, this makes a big batch, and it's really just an emulsifier. So if you whisk it with the other stuff, it thickens the dressing. And then something like honey to kind of even out the flavor and balance it. Okay, so our vegetables. So this should be the bulk of the diet, like I said, about half of the plate. Starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, and corn, they technically count toward the grains category of the healthy plate. So it's okay still, you know, for diabetic patients to have potatoes, but the portion size is very important. So it should be like the size of a hockey puck and not like half the plate. Non-starchy vegetables, either you can recommend the half plate at lunch and dinner or 3 to 5 servings a day. 1 serving being like a half cup of cooked vegetables or 1 cup of raw vegetables. So I encourage patients to choose a variety of colors, especially dark green, red, and orange, because there's different antioxidants in each and different nutrients that can be beneficial. And just a note about green vegetables, because I have a lot of patients on gluten therapy, and they tell me all the time, like, I can't have any green veggies at all. And so they just cut them out completely. But then they're substituting them for things like, I don't know, you know, carbohydrates and like starchy things. And so it is okay for them to have them. They just have to be aware to keep it consistent once the therapeutic window has been established. So that's important. But yeah, I suggest not cutting them out completely because green vegetables are a great source of lutein, which has been associated with improved insulin sensitivity and also reduced risk of atherosclerosis and CVD. So really helpful antioxidant there. So for the patients on a budget, there's a few options on here. So onions and garlic are great for adding a lot of flavor, especially on a low sodium diet. You can chop them up, saute them in some olive oil, throw them in a pan with some broccoli and carrots and roast it in the oven. That's a good budget-friendly side. Tomatoes are great for Mexican and Mediterranean dishes. Patients should look for no salt added versions, but if they can't find any, or you know, if they're one of the unfortunate ones that has to shop at like the small box stores, they can rinse and drain them and it'll remove about 40% of the sodium. Kale's another one. So a lot of people dislike kale because they say it's bitter, but actually if you chop it before you wash it, that avoids a lot of the bitterness. Also, winter squash, that can even be prepared in the microwave if you pierce it and put it in for a few minutes at a time and turn it until it's squishy. And canned pumpkin, that sounds like a weird one, but I use it all the time. Like there's several good recipes which I included in here because it's something different. So for this one, this can be made budget friendly too by subbing out the peanut butter for the tahini, which they have very similar flavor profiles. Like even Chef Anita Lowe on the Food Network a few years ago, she misidentified peanut butter as tahini. So they really do taste similar. And also, if someone can't afford the smoked paprika, they can just add more cumin. And this goes great with like sliced veggies, like sliced bell peppers, sliced carrots, or even turkey pumpkin chili. It looks like a lot of ingredients, but actually most of this stuff, like 4 of the things on here are like staples in a spice rack. And 5 of these things are on the affordable vegetables list. So really the most expensive thing is the ground turkey, and that could be subbed for white beans, which are also pretty affordable. And then just heart healthy pasta sauce. So some time saving tips. Meal prep is really important, and it's kind of a difficult habit to get into at first, but once you get, once patients get used to maybe setting aside like an hour every Sunday to chop veggies for the week and, portion stuff into little individual containers and even freezing, leftovers to reheat later, it becomes a lot easier. If somebody has a food processor, that saves a lot of time for chopping veggies. And you could roast massive trays of red onion, bell peppers, zucchini, broccoli, tomatoes for like 30 minutes, and you can portion those out for the week. And you can either reheat those in the oven or microwave. Frozen veggies are actually just as nutritious as fresh because they flash freeze them when they're at their peak, so they retain all those good nutrients. So in order to mitigate some of like, the mushiness that sometimes comes from reheating frozen things, I recommend either like steaming them in the microwave with just a very small amount of liquid. You don't want too much or else they'll get mushy. Or if you're adding them to a recipe, don't thaw them before, leave them frozen, and that'll prevent like the discoloration of green beans and it'll prevent them from getting mushy. And a good low sodium seasoning is just chili flakes, honey, and lemon juice. It adds some acid, some heat, and some sweetness. And this I give to my patients, like, so depending on what our goal is. So if it's a vegetable-based goal, and maybe it's to increase, add an extra serving of vegetables with dinner every night. So I'll have them pick out a few that they like, and I'll write this down for them, whatever the cooking times are, and we'll talk about, some methods favorite. So if they're making green beans, instead of using salt, they can use some of these herbs. These things pair well. So fruits. Usually recommend including a serving with breakfast and lunch, just because for breakfast, unless, sometimes an omelet's good with veggies, but otherwise it's kind of hard to get a bunch of veggies in at breakfast, so I figure it's a good window of opportunity to have some fruit in there. So 1 serving of fruit is ½ cup of cut up fruit, or 1 medium whole fruit, or a 1/4 cup of dried fruit. I don't recommend drinking juice just because it's basically the sugary part of the fruit and none of the fiber, so it's better to just have the whole fruit. And I have a lot of diabetic patients who are really worried about eating fruit, but it's important to emphasize portion size for them, because again, if we tell them to not eat one thing, they'll eat more of something else. So cutting out fruit completely, it gets rid of a whole food group that has a lot of antioxidants and fiber and beneficial vitamins and minerals, and it'll probably end up being replaced with something processed. Berries are great because they have anthocyanins, which they're members of the flavonoid antioxidant group, and they're potent free radical scavengers and have anti-inflammatory properties. So this is in fruits like blueberries, strawberries, raspberries, also your purple vegetables like red cabbage, radishes, eggplant, and even red wine. Those are all excellent sources. So some time-saving tips for fruit, just cutting it up in advance and freezing it yourself on a tray with parchment paper. That'll prevent it from sticking together, and then once it's frozen, you could put it all in a container. But if you just throw it all in a baggie and freeze it, it'll turn into like a giant ice pack. So that's what I recommend for that. And you can also just throw them in the blender later for smoothies. Frozen mango and banana works great in smoothies. Frozen berries can be heated up and mixed with non-fat plain Greek yogurt instead of buying fruited yogurt with a lot of added sugar. They work great as desserts like grilled peaches, baked apples, and also to prevent browning, like if someone slices up apples in advance for a salad or something, they can place it in a bowl and just mix up some honey and some warm water, pour it over the fruit and drain it, and that should make it last for about 24 hours. So some budget-friendly fruits, and these are also, some of them are good things to take on the go, like just, grab a banana or an apple or a pear, or bring a baggie of grapes to work to snack on instead of going to the vending machine. Those are good suggestions for patients too. Okay, so our whole grain. So the difference between a whole grain and a white grain is basically the white grain it has the shell of the whole grain removed, so it's missing the bran and the germ, which is the area of the grain that contains the most nutrients. It contains a lot of B vitamins, trace minerals, and antioxidants. And basically with the endosperm, or the middle part, you're just getting the carbohydrates and some protein. So it's best to eat as many whole grains as possible versus processed grains, because with the processed grains, like I said, it removes the fiber, healthy fats, vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients. And a consumption of a diet rich in highly processed grains has been associated with increased triglycerides and reduction in HDL. So they also increase in blood sugar more rapidly. So what to look for? So the ingredient list should start with whole grain or whole wheat. Anything that says 9-grain, multigrain, or wheat is essentially white bread in disguise. It also helps to follow the 5-to-1 rule. So for every 5 grams of carbohydrate in a food, they should have at least 1 gram of fiber. So if there's 15 grams of carbs, then you should have 3 grams of fiber. So I tell patients, the diabetic patients that go by like the exchange list, try to find whole grains that have 3 grams of fiber or more per serving. Okay, so like I mentioned before, the boiled whole grains are better than the processed grains like bread. So one of my personal favorites is farro, and on here it says semi-pearled farro, but I use the whole grain one. So with farro, the whole grain one actually cooks faster because the shell is still on it, and it creates kind of like a capsule. So the water gets in there and it steams it from the inside, and then the capsule bursts. So it's actually pretty quick. I'll normally use like 2 cups of like unsalted broth and 1 cup of farro, and you just bring it to a boil, turn it down, cover it, let it simmer for like 15 minutes or until all the liquid's gone. And then you basically have something that you can add to like salads or use as a side, or there's a bunch of different things that you could do with it. And it's good in the fridge for like 3 to 4 days. So I'll normally make a big batch of this on a Sunday, and we'll just kind of, add it to different things throughout the week. Some budget-friendly whole grains are brown rice, popcorn, whole grain pasta, and quinoa. And what's awesome about quinoa is it's also a complete protein. So it's very nutritious, and a little bit goes a long way. And so in order to make these more appetizing, I'll tell patients to add, when they're cooking it, instead of water, use unsalted chicken stock. Add some garlic powder, some black pepper. For the pasta, olive oil, and just fresh herbs. And if not fresh, they could use dry, but fresh really has a lot more flavor. And so for quinoa, lemon, red pepper, and cumin work really great. Quinoa can also be added to salads too, or it can be eaten as a side. It can be eaten for breakfast with some fruit added to it. It's pretty versatile. Okay, we talked about that. This is like one of my favorite salads in the world. I wanted to put the recipe on here, but it was too long, but there's a link there if you guys are interested. I've shared this with a few of my patients, and they really like it. It's pretty versatile because you could swap out, so there's apples in it, you could swap those out for mangoes or peaches or whatever you have on hand. And it's really easy and simple. And we normally make a batch of this, and my fiance and I, it'll last us both for 2 people, probably like 2 dinners worth. So like 4 portions. Okay, so our proteins. Protein is interesting. It has baggage essentially. So when we eat protein foods, we're not just eating the protein. And so that explains why, plant proteins are more beneficial than animal proteins. And even though our body processes these amino acids the same essentially, the thing is when you're eating plant-based protein, you're getting fiber with it, you're getting antioxidants, you're getting all these vitamins, minerals. Most animal-based proteins come with saturated fat, cholesterol, so they don't keep as good of company as the plant-based proteins. So that's why a whole food plant-based diet has been associated with decreased risk factors and also coronary heart disease progression. So also the Nurses' Health study sort of showed this too. So they saw that cutting back on the refined carbohydrates and increasing plant protein was very beneficial. However, they didn't see a difference if you replaced those they did not see a difference if people ate more animal protein and also, Okay, so plant-based proteins. So we have the legumes group, and out of that, pulses are the most beneficial in terms of protein. Peas are also in the legumes group, but they're considered like starchy vegetables because they're not as high in protein. So for a quarter cup of pulses equals about 1 ounce of meat. So on our little My Plate thing that we had earlier, a serving of meat was 3 ounces. So you need about 3/4 of a cup of these pulses in order to be equivalent to like a serving of meat. But these are very versatile and a lot of them are inexpensive. So we have beans, all kinds of beans like kidney, black-eyed peas, black beans, pinto beans, fava beans. Chickpeas are also on here, and lentils. A lot of them are fortunately on the budget-friendly protein sources list. So like dried lentils and beans are super affordable and very versatile. You don't have to soak lentils, but definitely rinse them really well because they get like lots of dirt and seeds and stuff on there. And for beans, to speed up the cooking process, you can soak them in advance, but you don't have to. Canned beans are also an option, but they're full of salt. So I'll tell my patients to definitely make sure they find like the no salt added ones or at least reduced sodium. So some other things on here. So chicken breast, low sodium canned tuna and water. Some of these things are practical. So it's not really practical to tell somebody that they have to switch to a complete vegetarian diet because plant protein's best. Everything has its place, and it's not necessarily that chicken breast is bad for us. It just doesn't have all, you know, the same nutrients as like plant-based foods. So I'll, if anything, encourage patients to have maybe 1 or 2 vegetarian nights a week, and then the other times they can eat like chicken breast or salmon, like fish and stuff like that. And this is just another little like formula thing, DIY Veggie Burger, which can work well with like the budget-friendly foods. So for example, you just need a grain, so like a cup of rolled oats, a protein, a 1/2 cup of cooked chickpeas, a non-starchy veggie. It can be diced onion, it can be diced peppers, whatever you have on hand, herbs and spices, and then a binder. So something like sticky to hold it all together. So either mashed beans or cooked sweet potato. And overnight oats. The oats are a great source of protein too, and they're super easy. This, you just put it in a jar basically, and it's ready the next morning. So my patients that aren't really into breakfast, I'll try to get them to do this and put some fruit on it just to, you know, add that extra serving of fruit to their diet without too much trouble. Seafood, so omega-3 fatty fish is excellent for you. So salmon, fresh tuna, mackerel, herring, these are all great sources. Due to high salt content, I recommend that CHF patients avoid sardines and like canned tuna, except for the low sodium kind. So white flesh fish are a good second option. So sea bass, pollock, and grouper. Shellfish are naturally higher in sodium, but raw shrimp and soft clams can be lower if purchased fresh and cooked without salty ingredients. It's really hard to tell though. It just depends who you're sourcing it from. I'm guessing people like on the East Coast probably have better access to these things than we do, because by the time they get here, you know, there's so much added to them to preserve them, unless you know like a really good like fish place. It's kind of difficult to do that on a low sodium diet. So poultry should be consumed less often than plant-based proteins. Just make sure you remove the skin and use heart-healthy cooking techniques, and also to check for sodium content in the food labels. A lot of poultry is injected. Even the most common brands like Tyson, Purdue, if you look, a lot of the manufacturers inject them before they even get to the store. So look for things on the label that indicate that basically. So dairy is kind of neutral. The studies go either way, and they're pretty inconclusive. Also, the problem with like big food industry is a lot of the studies are funded by the big food industry, so it's kind of hard to get like unbiased actual data. So I normally just say when in doubt, moderation. And especially there has been some data to show that like fermented low-fat dairy like yogurt is very beneficial, so I'll definitely recommend that. But in terms of milk, like if patients like milk, well, do the lower fat varieties, skim or 1%, and just in moderation. I would avoid eating too much cheese and stuff like that. But so just some additional tips that didn't really fit into any category, but that I think are really cool. So for people who have trouble finding like specialty low sodium items, again, at like some of these small box stores that don't really carry no salt added canned vegetables, Amazon Prime Pantry is good for non-perishables. So they offer free shipping for Prime members with a $35 order minimum. But what's really cool is for EBT and Medicaid card holders, they're eligible for a discounted Prime membership, which is $5.99 a month. So that's about the cost of like a pack of cigarettes or a 12-pack of pop cans for people that are saying like, oh, $5.99 a month, I don't know. Because actually the products are pretty affordable. Some of them are even cheaper than I cross-checked them with like Walmart. And they were either similar or even actually cheaper on there. They tend to rotate prices, so like certain things will be kind of like on sale one week or another, but yeah, so that's always a good option. Orders arrive within 4 business days. And also for convenience factor, people can shop from their smartphone and reduce the amount of time spent navigating a grocery store. So whenever I go to Kroger and it's busy, I literally run through and grab whatever I need, end up forgetting stuff half the time just because I want to get out of there. So that's a good way to sort of supplement with some of those staples for your pantry. Another thing that was alarming to me is the food waste that we produce in this country. It represents about 1,300 calories per person per day. So that is enough calories to feed like, basically all the women and children in this country and most of like a man's day's worth, which is so crazy. So another way to save money is just to, like stretch food, repurpose leftovers, avoid throwing things away. There's lots of good educational resources online that show you sort of how to use weird parts of food that you wouldn't realize you could eat. And I included some links at the end of this presentation, just if you're interested. Also, like having an eat now box. So sometimes like stuff tends to get lost in our fridge, and then we'll find it later. And I feel really guilty, like, oh my God, I can't believe I forgot to make this stuff and I let it go bad. So I'll normally sort of set those in specific parts of the fridge, or even keep a list on the fridge of like the eat now box, just things that we need to eat within the next few days and check them off as we go. I also use Google a lot to create like my own chop challenge kind of. Whatever I have on hand that I need to use, I'll just put all those words together, and if I'm in a hurry, I'll put like quick recipe or whatever, and usually find something good. Like this was the first thing that came up when I typed in budget garlic black bean quinoa recipe. And I always recommend cutting out the salt and whatever other herbs they have in there. Like this one has pepper, I'll just add more of that, but that works pretty well. Also, just tips for your convenience speaker patient. I encourage them to keep healthy snacks at the office to avoid getting hungry and going to the vending machine, so that it even could be like baggies of fruit or bringing some almonds, just getting in the habit of like keeping, bringing that every day or keeping stuff in their drawers. Plan ahead. So this, like I said before, is hard, but just takes some getting used to, making a shopping list, chopping stuff in advance. Slow cookers are great to save time for a patient on the budget. Okay, we talked about this stuff. Portion size is important for that as well. Okay, so these are some handouts and resources that I really love that I wanted to share with you guys. The first one is awesome. It's like these short 1-minute videos that show you, any vegetable or fruit you can think of. It tells you how to pick it out, how to prepare it, and how to like chop it and cook it. Guide for cooking with whole grains. The healthy plate handout's great for meal planning. And then this Mediterranean diet one I love too. So I hope that these things will be helpful for you guys. Anyone have any questions?
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll make sure to share that with everybody who's attending.
Yeah, I'll send the slides to you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Yeah, just real quick, before we end the session, I did have one question. Like, if you had to, I know it's very difficult, and we talk about this a lot also over in the endocrine echo program. If you had to like recommend a repeating days diet for your patients, what do you think would be the most common things you see?
What do you mean in terms of repeating days? Like,
You know, if like the most common thing that you would recommend, like have this for breakfast, have this for lunch, have this for dinner.
okay. Well, I was thinking sort of in terms of like Michael Pollan, who's a journalist who wrote a really good book called In Defense of Food. And his mantra is eat real food, mostly plants, not too much. So for breakfast, I mean, it's kind of hard to say like a full diet plan right now, but sort of like that healthy eating plate. So I would say for breakfast, so try to have like a protein and a fruit, maybe, and a grain. So like some whole grain bread and like a serving of fruit, like those serving sizes from that handout.
Mm-hmm.
And like either like an egg, or, you know, if you're making an omelet, have some black beans in there. For lunch, so there's something called, I don't know if you've seen those bento boxes online, but those are helpful for like packing lunches, because like a lunch doesn't have to be like this gourmet planned out meal. Like my lunches are normally a series of kind of like snacks. So I'll have like a category of almonds. Like I sort of like breaking foods up into categories because it just, I don't know, makes it easier. So yeah, having like an almond in there, and like maybe some almonds, a boiled egg, and then some grapes, and then some veggie slices, some hummus. Sort of just getting a variety of different foods that don't have a whole lot of ingredients in them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions today? I'll make sure, of course, to forward you any questions I get emailed afterward.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thank you all. Our session is in 2 weeks, and I'll send out that reminder.